Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Ask a Therapist with me, your host, Joy Schwartz, MBA, MA, and LPC Intern supervised by Ken Johnson, Ph.D. On Ask a Therapist, we tackle common counseling challenges in the moment, and initially I'll come prepared with my own commonly heard counseling challenges in a career counseling context or in a mental health or life-related context, and then over time we'll address questions that come up from our live video audience. So thank you for joining. Again, for those of you just joining, this is Ask a Therapist with your host, Joy Schwartz. And in the month of October, we've been covering work-related challenges. And today's work-related counseling challenge is, I don't think my self-introduction or my elevator pitch is working for me, so how can I make it better? And we joked earlier this week when I put it out on Facebook that I was covering this topic, and this week is Halloween, and we humorously introduced it as, I think I scare people when I introduce myself, but the reality is we could all get better at the way we introduce ourselves, both in writing and verbally, and not just in an interview context, which is a part of what we'll cover today, but even in chance encounters with networking contacts or with people that you might need to exchange introductions with in your day-to-day work. And so there's a lot of different contexts in which we might want to introduce ourselves, and again, we could all get better at doing so. So today we're actually going to cover it in terms of three focus areas, or three steps you can take to improve your self-introduction, whether it's written or whether it's in terms of verbal delivery, or your elevator pitch, which is, again, intended to deliver verbally. So we'll focus both on the content as well as on the delivery. So again, there's three steps. And the first one is really to come prepared with a formula. So, and we'll introduce what that looks like in a moment. The second one is to be able to tell a cohesive story. And the third is to prepare for that actual delivery. So again, those three steps are to come prepared with a formula, to tell a cohesive story, and to prepare for the actual delivery of your self-introduction or your pitch. So let's get into those in a little bit more detail, but I guess before I do, I want to share that I've coached hundreds of students and professionals as it relates to their pitch and that written self-introduction. And I think we sometimes joke, and we actually joked in my the second podcast episode when I was bantering back and forth with my podcasting partner on this very topic, and we commented that people often get so scared about networking, they would rather experience bodily harm than have to introduce themselves with a networking contact, or worse yet, even in a networking event. So the goal here really is to distill all that ambiguity down to those few simple steps so that you can feel more confident when you're introducing yourself, and also to alleviate a lot of that fear that comes with it. And sometimes we think to ourselves, well, if I spend all this time practicing, isn't it going to sound rehearsed? And the reality is, the more that we practice and we're aware of both the content and the delivery mechanism we want to use when introducing ourselves, it actually does sound a lot less rehearsed and a lot more natural and comfortable. So that's what I want to bring to you today. So for those of you just joining, welcome back to Ask a Therapist, again with your host, Joy Schwartz. And today's topic really revolves around the way we introduce ourselves, both in terms of the written self-introduction and our elevator pitch that we might deliver verbally. And so I'm introducing three steps that you might want to take to enhance either your written self-introduction or your verbal elevator pitch. And again, those steps are to come prepared with a formula, and I'll introduce what that formula is momentarily, to be able to tell a cohesive story, and third, to make sure that you prepare for the actual delivery itself. So let's get into those three steps in more detail. So the first one is to come prepared with a formula, or to use a formula. And the one I recommend is called present, past, and future. So the present is about talking about what you do now in terms of I work or I do X for whom, the organization you work for, which gives me the opportunity to do A, B, and C. So again, kind of what you do, who you do it for, and what you have the opportunity to do on a day-to-day basis, and try to keep that a little bit more exciting if you can. I think sometimes we forget that because we get so into the weeds of our roles that we forget that we really want to articulate what we do in an energetic, constructive way and make sure that really clearly defines us. And sometimes I find in working with clients that they forget to keep it constructive. And I have to remind them that even if they're miserable in their work experience, it's not okay to share that in the actual pitch and in the present part of it. So you really want to keep that positive and constructive. And sharing that you're miserable in your job and your boss is worthless is not going to get you very far. And that's where working with someone like a career counselor can help you kind of reframe things in the right sort of way. And then the second step in that formula is the past. And the past is really about providing a brief synopsis of your past experience in a way where one experience kind of builds on another. And so the way to think about that is thinking about it in terms of a couple ways. So there's the functional build from one role to another. Maybe you became more of an effective generalist or general manager because you've had cross-functional experiences around a bunch of different areas. Maybe you can think about it in terms of what you've learned from one successive experience to another. And there's other ways to think about it too, but those are just a couple of them. But the most important thing is to feel like you're focusing and not to cover everything. So be really particular about what you choose to cover in the past and try to limit it to 2 sentences or so if you can, maybe even less. You don't want to bore someone that you're connecting with by detailing every element of your past experience and educational history chronologically. So then the third part of the formula is the future. And this is about your next steps in your career journey as well as the ask. And this is the one that most people leave out. They often think, they just forget to help their networking contact or whoever they're delivering the pitch to, whether it's verbally or in writing, they forget to share what it is or how the person can help them. So when I was recently working with a client on this one, she was struggling with how to share what that future was or that next career move because she was still trying to figure it out herself. And so it's completely appropriate to say something like, I'm still early in my career exploration process, or I'm still early in determining what my next steps are, which addresses that next career move part. And then you could share something like, I'd really like to hear more about you and learn more about your own career trajectory or how you ended up in X function, which which will certainly address the ask part of it. So how this person can help you. And you may get into the dialogue with them and realize, oh, you forgot, because they'll ask, you forgot the ask because they inevitably say something like, well, how can I help you? And so what you want to do is give them the opportunity to ask that question and take a deep breath and just kind of go back in with your ask and pick up where you left off, and the dialogue will go from there. So again, that first step is really to have that clear formula. The present, what you're doing now, the past, the brief synopsis of your past experience, and then the future, which is your next career move, and even if you don't know it, that's okay, as well as the ask you have of your conversation partner or the person you're reaching out to via email. So again, that's the first part of our step, is to have follow a formula. The second is to tell a cohesive story. And again, this one ties back to the past part of the formula pretty strongly. When I work with clients, they often struggle with how to tell a story about their past experience and to see how one experience connects with another, and to show how there's a successive build from those past experiences to where they are now. And most recently, when working with a client, we talked about how to articulate that cohesive story in terms of what she learned from one experience to the next. And that even if those jobs or roles didn't feel like they connected together, that there was still something valuable that she learned from her experience in a startup, and then her experience working in a professional services firm, to her experience actually serving clients. And so inevitably she was able to tell a more compelling story, but because she was so in the weeds on her current role and kind of the quandary that she was in, we got her to a better place. So that's just a little bit about, or some context around telling that cohesive story. For me, I like to kind of bucket my experiences. So I think about it in terms of the recruiting part of my career, the coaching part of my career, and the talent management part of my experience. And so that helps me to be able to tell that cohesive story when I'm introducing myself as well. So then that's kind of our second step, which is around, again, telling that cohesive story. The third step is around preparing. And while it may seem common sense to prepare for a networking event, or certainly to prepare for an interview, people often forget, and I don't think they realize how much you really do need to prepare. And this is different for all of us, but recently I was working with another client who was interviewing, and fortunately he actually had the opportunity to know what questions he would be asked in an online interview before it happened. We don't often have the luxury of that sort of situation, but the great thing is, in this case, he knew what was coming, and it's very likely that all of us would be asked that "tell me about yourself" question, which he was. And I actually advised him to prepare or to practice his pitch and his response to that question 5 times on his own, typing it or writing it, and then another 5 to 7 times practicing in front of a mirror or with someone else. And then we actually rehearsed it together. So quite a bit of rehearsal just for the introduction. And then in the career management class that I teach at a local university, I actually have the students in my class write down their elevator pitch or their self-introduction to prepare for verbal delivery, or prepare it for verbal delivery. And then we actually engage in a speed networking type of exercise where they have the opportunity to practice it over several rounds. And both in the case with the client I mentioned, as well with my students, they kind of rolled their eyes at me when I gave them the instructions of what I wanted them to do to prepare. But inevitably, after we got through the interview for my client and the 3 rounds with the students in my class, they commented on how appreciative they were that they had the opportunity to actually practice. So I can't stress enough how important that is. And even when you think that all that time you're practicing, whether it's for the purpose of your pitch or even for potential interview questions you might get asked, you will inevitably sound more comfortable and more natural the more you prepare. So it sounds counterintuitive, but I truly believe it works. So again, to recap what we've covered in terms of your self-introduction or your elevator pitch, it's really those 3 steps. Number 1 is to follow a formula. Number 2 is to tell a cohesive story. And number 3 is to prepare. And all 3 of those steps will help you both in terms of your content, what you actually say about yourself, as well as your delivery. So thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode of Ask a Therapist. Don't forget to visit my blog and website, www.joyschwartz.com, for more on this topic. And I look forward to seeing you next week on Ask a Therapist, 2:00 p.m. Central Time. Thanks for joining.